Hello everyone. Welcome back to Horrifying Stories. I know a lot of you like to listen to these videos before falling asleep, and I'm here to help. Before you drift off, please leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Story 1. The first snow of the season blanketed the small mountain town like a scene from a postcard. White flakes drifted lazily to the ground, covering the streets and rooftops in a shimmering, pristine layer. But as beautiful as it was, there was something unsettling about this winter. The air carried a heaviness, a silent warning that most of the townsfolk ignored, or perhaps refused to acknowledge. For Emily Harper, the isolation of winter in this remote town was both a curse and a comfort. She had moved here 3 months ago, hoping to escape the chaos of city life. The biting cold and quiet nights were exactly what she had needed to mend her fractured spirit. Or so she thought. Her cabin, nestled deep in the woods at the base of Mount Halewood, had always been peaceful. But as the snow piled higher and the nights grew longer, Emily began to feel watched. At first, it was just a passing unease, the kind that came from living alone in such a secluded place. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. The first time Emily noticed something was wrong, it was subtle, a small thing, easy to dismiss. She had been sitting by the fireplace, a steaming mug of cocoa in her hands, watching the flames dance and crackle. Outside, the snowstorm howled, wind rattling against the windows. It was the kind of night that made her grateful for the warmth of the fire and the thick wool blanket wrapped around her. Then she heard it, a faint sound, almost drowned out by the wind. At first, she thought it was just the trees creaking under the weight of the snow. But it came again, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't the trees. Emily's gaze drifted to the window. The glass was frosted over, making it impossible to see outside. She stood, her heart beating just a little faster, and approached the window cautiously. The tapping stopped. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, peering out into the white abyss, but all she could see was the snow swirling under the pale glow of her porch light. She told herself it was just a branch blown against the cabin, nothing more. After all, the wind could play tricks on the ears. Satisfied, she returned to her seat by the fire, pushing the sound to the back of her mind. The next morning, Emily woke to a world buried under several feet of snow. She bundled up in her thickest coat and boots before heading outside to clear the path to her car. The air was crisp, the sky a pale gray. As her shovel bit into the heavy snow, she caught sight of something that made her pause. Footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, a trail of them leading from the edge of the woods to her cabin. The tracks didn't belong to an animal. They were too large, too human. Her stomach twisted as she followed them with her eyes. They stopped right beneath her bedroom window. Emily's first thought was that someone had gotten lost in the storm. It wasn't unheard of. Hikers and campers sometimes wandered too far from the trails and ended up stranded. But why hadn't they knocked on her door for help? And where had they gone? The footprints didn't lead away from the cabin. They simply stopped. That night, Emily double-checked the locks on every door and window. She told herself there was a logical explanation for the footprints. Perhaps the storm had erased part of the trail, making it look like they vanished. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the image of those prints ending just beneath her window. The tapping started again around midnight. This time it was louder, more insistent. Emily sat up in bed, her pulse quickening. She reached for her phone, but there was no signal, another gift of living in the middle of nowhere. The sound moved, circling the cabin. It wasn't just at one window anymore. It was at all of them. Tap, tap, tap. Her mind raced. Could it be an animal? A bear, maybe? But bears hibernated in the winter, didn't they? And no animal could move so quickly, so deliberately. Gathering her courage, Emily crept out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand. She made her way to the living room, every creak of the floorboard setting her nerves on edge. The tapping continued, relentless. She shone the flashlight toward the nearest window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the frosted glass. Her breath caught in her throat. There, pressed against the window, was a handprint. It was huge, far larger than any human hand should be, with long, spindly fingers that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. The tapping stopped. The next day, Emily drove into town, desperate for answers. She told herself she wasn't running away. She just needed to be around other people, to shake off the eerie isolation that had been creeping over her. At the diner, she struck up a conversation with one of the locals, an older man named Walter who had lived in the area his entire life. "Strange things happen up on Halewood," Walter said, stirring his coffee with a weathered hand. "Always have. Most folks don't talk about it, don't want to scare off the tourists. But the ones who live out there, they know better." "What kind of strange things?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Walter leaned in, his expression grim. "Things come out of the woods in the winter, things that ain't supposed to exist. They're drawn to the cold, to the quiet. They say the storms wake them up." Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine. "What do they want?" Walter shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe they're just curious. Maybe they're hungry. All I know is, if you hear tapping at your window, you don't look, you don't open the door, and you sure as hell don't go outside." That night, Emily sat in her cabin with all the lights on, her heart pounding every time the wind howled. She had thought about staying in town, maybe even renting a room at the inn, but she hadn't wanted to leave her cabin unguarded. The tapping started just after midnight. It was louder this time, more forceful. Emily sat frozen on the couch, her eyes fixed on the windows. She could see the faint outline of movement beyond the glass, a dark shape shifting in the shadows. "Don't look," she whispered to herself, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. "Don't look." The sound grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't just tapping anymore, it was pounding. The windows rattled, the walls creaked. And then, for the first time, she heard it. A voice. "Emily!" Her name, drawn out in a low, guttural whisper. "Let me in." She clamped her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth, tears streaming down her face. "It's not real," she muttered. "It's not real." But deep down, she knew it was. The pounding stopped just before dawn. When Emily finally found the courage to look outside, the snow was untouched. There were no footprints, no sign that anything, or anyone, had been there. But on the window, where the handprint had been the night before, there was a single word, scrawled in the frost: "Soon." Story 2. The church had stood at the edge of Blackwood for centuries, a stone sentinel against the elements. Its spire pierced the heavens, often obscured by the thick winter mist that rolled down from the mountains. Locals called it St. Hallow's Watch, but over the years, its reputation had shifted. No one went near it after dark, especially in winter. To Anna Gray, a city journalist visiting Blackwood for a feature story, the church was nothing more than an architectural relic. She had come to this remote town to write about winter traditions in isolated communities. The locals were welcoming enough, offering warm cider and stories of their age-old customs, but whenever she brought up the church, their smiles would fade. Another warned her, "Don't stay out too late. The frost carries voices. Anna dismissed their superstitions as small-town folklore. She had grown up in a bustling city, surrounded by noise and people. The quiet of Blackwood, though serene, felt too still, too empty. But it was precisely that stillness that drew her to St. Hallow's Watch. On her third night in Blackwood, after the locals had gone to bed and the snow had begun to fall in earnest, Anna bundled herself in a thick coat and scarf and set out toward the church with her camera in hand. The walk was eerie, the only sounds her boots crunching against the snow, and the occasional rustle of wind through the barren trees. The path to the church was unlit, a narrow trail that wound through the woods. The snow seemed to swallow all sound, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. When she finally reached the clearing, the church loomed before her like a shadow against the pale glow of the snow-covered ground. Its windows were dark, its doors slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Anna hesitated for a moment, her breath fogging in the icy air. She felt an inexplicable urge to turn back, to return to the safety of her rented cabin. But curiosity won out. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The interior was colder than she expected, the stone walls leaching the warmth from the air. Moonlight streamed through the cracked stained glass, casting fragmented patterns on the floor. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward the altar, covered in a fine layer of frost. Anna shivered, her breath visible in the dim light. She raised her camera and began snapping photos, the click of the shutter echoing in the empty space. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and decay, a far cry from the holy sanctuary it once must have been. As she moved closer to the altar, she noticed something strange. The frost on the pews wasn't random. It formed patterns, intricate swirls and shapes that almost looked like faces. She leaned in closer, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck. The faces in the frost were faint, but unmistakable. Hollow eyes and open mouths, as if frozen mid-scream. A chill ran down her spine. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the light. But as she straightened, she heard it, a low, melodic hum. It started softly, barely audible over the creak of the old building. But as she stood frozen in place, the sound grew louder, filling the church with an otherworldly resonance. It was a choir, voices weaving together in haunting harmony. Anna's heart pounded. She turned toward the door, but it was no longer open. It was shut tight, frost creeping along its edges. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The choir stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a single voice answered, whispering from the shadows. "Why have you come here?" Anna spun around, her flashlight beam darting across the church. There was no one there, only the empty pews and the frost-covered altar. I'm a journalist," she stammered. "I'm writing a story." The voice laughed, low and chilling. "Stories," it said. "That's all we are now." The frost on the altar began to shift, spreading outward in jagged lines that crept along the floor. Anna backed away, her boots slipping on the icy surface. The patterns in the frost grew clearer, the faces more defined. They weren't just frozen. They were alive, their eyes following her, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak. The choir resumed, louder this time, their song a mournful lament that made her chest tighten. She stumbled toward the door, her breath coming in panicked gasps. The frost climbed the walls, the pews, the very air around her seeming to freeze. As she reached the door, her hands trembling, she felt the frost biting at her skin, creeping up her legs. The voices grew deafening, a cacophony of anguish and despair. "Join us," the voice whispered in her ear, so close she could feel the cold breath against her neck. Anna slammed her hands against the door, desperate to escape. The frost burned her fingers, but she didn't stop. Finally, with one last shove, the door gave way, and she tumbled out into the snow. The voices stopped. She lay there for a moment, the cold seeping into her bones, before scrambling to her feet. She didn't look back as she ran, her boots slipping and sliding on the icy path. When she reached the edge of the woods, she collapsed, gasping for air. The town was still visible in the distance, its lights a beacon of safety. But as she stood to make her way back, she realized something was wrong. The frost that had covered the church had followed her, spreading along the ground in jagged lines. The faces were there too, faint but visible, their hollow eyes watching her every move. The air was filled with whispers, faint and indistinct, but growing louder with each step she took. "Join us," they sang. By the time Anna reached the town, the frost had overtaken the road, the trees, and the very air around her. The lights of Blackwood flickered, then went out, leaving her in darkness. And in the silence, the choir sang on. Story 3. It was said that no one truly knew the depths of White Willow Lake. Situated on the outskirts of the northern village of Fjord Haven, the lake froze solid every winter, its surface a vast expanse of unbroken ice. Locals told stories of strange shadows that moved beneath it, but most dismissed these tales as the product of an overactive imagination. Elias, a 16-year-old boy who had recently moved to Fjord Haven with his family, found the lake fascinating. The eerie quiet of the frozen water, and the way the ice sparkled under the pale winter sun seemed almost magical. His parents often warned him not to wander out on the ice alone. "It's not as solid as it looks," his mother would say. "People have gone missing." But Elias was a restless spirit. One gray afternoon, while his parents were busy preparing for the village's winter festival, he grabbed his skates and headed for the lake. The wind was biting as he made his way across the snow-covered field to the edge of White Willow. The ice stretched before him, smooth and inviting. He laced up his skates, adjusted his scarf, and stepped onto the ice. At first, it was exhilarating. The cold air stung his cheeks, and the rhythmic glide of his skates was soothing. He ventured further out, the village shrinking behind him until it was little more than a collection of faint lights on the horizon. The ice beneath him was perfectly clear, like glass. As he skated, he could see the dark water below, its depths seemingly endless. But something caught his eye, a shadow, faint and fleeting, moving beneath the surface. Elias stopped, his breath fogging in the air. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. A fish, perhaps, but it was far too large for that. The shadow moved again, closer this time. A chill ran down his spine, unrelated to the cold. He bent down, peering into the ice. The shadow was still there, shifting and swirling like ink in water. He couldn't make out any distinct shape, but he felt certain it was watching him. He straightened and began skating back toward the shore, his heart pounding. The shadow followed, keeping pace beneath the ice. "Just a trick of the light," he whispered to himself, though his voice trembled. But then he heard it, a low, mournful sound, like a distant whale song, muffled by the ice. He froze in place, his breath hitching. The sound grew louder, more insistent, resonating through the ice and into his very bones. And then the ice cracked. It wasn't a loud sound, just a faint, sharp pop that echoed in the still air. Elias looked down to see a thin fracture running beneath his feet, spidering outward. Panic surged through him. He turned and began skating as fast as he could toward the shore, the fracture spreading in his wake. The shadow beneath the ice grew larger, more defined. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a shape. A hand. Elias's skates slipped, and he fell hard onto the ice, the breath knocked out of him. The The sound of cracking ice was deafening now, a chorus of sharp, splintering notes. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain, and ran, his skates clumsy on the uneven surface. Behind him, the ice shattered. He didn't dare look back. The sound of rushing water and the mournful wail of the creature filled his ears. The shore was so close. He could see the snow-covered field, the faint lights of the village beyond. But then the ice beneath him gave way. Elias plunged into the freezing water, the shock stealing the air from his lungs. The cold was unlike anything he'd ever felt, a searing, all-encompassing pain that numbed his limbs almost instantly. He kicked desperately, his hands clawing at the edge of the ice, but it was slick, offering no purchase. The shadow loomed beneath him, rising slowly. A face emerged from the depths, pale, with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth that seemed to scream without sound. Elias thrashed, his vision blurring. The face drew closer, its hand reaching out to him. He felt its icy fingers close around his ankle, pulling him down. He tried to scream, but the water filled his mouth, freezing and bitter. And then everything went still. When Elias woke, he was lying on the snow-covered shore. His clothes were soaked, his body trembling uncontrollably. He coughed up water, gasping for air, his chest burning. The lake was silent, its surface unbroken. There was no sign of the hole he'd fallen through, no crack in the ice, no shadow beneath. He staggered to his feet, his legs weak, and stumbled toward the village. That night, as he lay in bed, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot tea, he couldn't shake the feeling of those icy fingers on his skin. When he closed his eyes, he saw the pale face staring up at him from the depths. The villagers said nothing when he told them what had happened. They only looked at him with sad, knowing eyes. "You were lucky to escape," one of them said quietly. Elias didn't feel lucky, and every winter after that, when the lake froze over, he would hear it, the mournful song of the creature beneath the ice, calling to him. Story 4. The blizzard came suddenly, blanketing the small town of Hollow Pines in a suffocating white shroud. Roads were closed, power lines fell, and the townsfolk huddled in their homes, waiting for the storm to pass. For Clara and her younger brother Jamie, it was both a blessing and a curse. Their parents were stuck in the city, unable to return home, leaving the siblings alone in their creaky old house. But for 12-year-old Jamie, it was an adventure. "Let's build a snowman," he said eagerly, his eyes bright with excitement as the wind howled outside. Clara, 17 and far more pragmatic, hesitated. "It's freezing out there," she warned, glancing at the frosted windows. "And it's getting dark." "Just for a little while," Jamie pleaded, tugging on her arm. "Please? You promised we'd do something fun." Reluctantly, Clara relented, bundling both of them in layers of clothing before stepping out into the storm. The wind bit at their faces, and the snow was so thick it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. They trudged to the front yard, where the snow had piled high. Jamie immediately began scooping handfuls, shaping them into the base of the snowman. Clara helped, her gloved hands stiff with cold. As the snowman took shape, Jamie grinned. "It needs a face," he said, rummaging through his pockets for a pair of old buttons and a broken twig. He pressed the buttons into the snow for eyes and stuck the twig where the mouth should be. Clara stepped back to admire their work. The snowman was lopsided, its head slightly too large for its body, but Jamie was beaming with pride. "It's perfect," he said. Clara smiled despite the cold. "All right, we're done. Let's go inside before we freeze." But as they turned to leave, Jamie froze, his gaze fixed on the snowman. "What's wrong?" Clara asked, her voice tinged with concern. Jamie pointed. It moved. Clara frowned, following his gaze. The snowman stood exactly as they'd left it, its button eyes staring blankly ahead. "It's just the wind," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Jamie didn't look convinced, but he nodded and followed her back into the house. That night, as the storm raged on, Clara couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. The snowman's blank stare lingered in her mind, and she found herself glancing out the window more often than she cared to admit. Around midnight, as she was about to head to bed, she heard it. A faint, crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. Her heart skipped a beat. She tiptoed to the window and peered out into the darkness. The snowman was gone. Clara stared, her breath fogging the glass. The yard was empty, save for the swirling snow. But as she squinted into the storm, she saw them. Footprints, leading away from where the snowman had stood. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Jamie," she whispered, rushing to his room. He was asleep, his small form bundled under a pile of blankets. She shook him gently, and he groggily opened his eyes. "What is it?" he mumbled. "The snowman," she said, her voice trembling. "It's gone." Jamie sat up, his eyes wide. "What do you mean, gone?" "It's not in the yard anymore," she said. "There are footprints in the snow." Jamie hesitated for a moment, then threw off his blankets. "We have to find it." "No," Clara said firmly, blocking the door. "We're staying inside." But Jamie was already pulling on his coat. "What if it's lost?" he said, his voice filled with a strange urgency. "It's a snowman, Jamie," Clara snapped, her frustration masking her fear. "It's not alive." Jamie looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You didn't hear it," he said softly. Clara's blood ran cold. "Hear what?" "Before we went inside," Jamie whispered. "It whispered my name." Clara didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as her brother's overactive imagination, but the look in his eyes told her he was serious. "Stay here," she said, grabbing a flashlight. "I'll check the yard." Jamie started to protest, but she cut him off. "No arguments. Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me. Got it?" Reluctantly, Jamie nodded, and Clara stepped out into the storm. The wind howled, and the snow stung her face as she scanned the yard with the flashlight. The footprints were still there, leading toward the woods at the edge of their property. She followed them, her boots sinking into the deep snow. The further she went, the more uneasy she felt. The footprints were too perfect, too deliberate, as if someone, or something, had carefully placed each step. As she neared the tree line, she heard it. A faint, raspy whisper. "Jamie." She froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The voice came again, louder this time. "Jamie!" Her breath caught in her throat. She swung the flashlight around, its beam cutting through the darkness. And then she saw it. The snowman stood at the edge of the woods, its button eyes glinting in the light. But it wasn't the same. Its mouth, once a simple twig, had twisted into a sinister grin. Its body was no longer smooth and round, but jagged, as if carved from ice. "Stay away!" Clara shouted, her voice breaking. The snowman tilted its head, its grin widening, and then it moved. The snowman stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Clara stumbled back, her heart pounding. "Jamie!" the snowman rasped, its voice echoing through the storm. Clara turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. The sound of crunching snow followed her, growing louder with each step. When she reached the house, she banged on the door. "Jamie, let me in." The door flew open, and Jamie pulled her inside. She slammed it shut and locked it, her chest heaving. "What happened?" Jamie asked, his face pale. Clara didn't answer. She grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, her hands shaking. For hours they sat in silence, listening to the storm. But the snowman didn't return. When morning came, Clara cautiously opened the door. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine blanket of snow. There were no footprints, and no sign of the snowman. But as Clara and Jamie stepped outside, they saw it, etched into the frost on the window, in jagged, uneven letters. "See you soon." Clara stared at the words etched into the frost, her breath catching in her throat. Jamie stood beside her, clutching her hand tightly, his small fingers trembling. Neither of them spoke, their gazes fixed on the message that shouldn't have been there. "See you soon." The frost began to melt under the weak winter sun, but the message lingered, as if burned into their minds. "What does it mean?" Jamie whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara didn't answer. She didn't know. All she knew was that they weren't safe. Not here, not anywhere. "We're leaving," she said finally, her voice firm. Jamie looked up at her, his eyes wide. "But where will we go?" "Anywhere but here," Clara said, pulling him back into the house. "Get your coat. We'll go to Aunt Maggie's." They packed quickly, throwing essentials into a bag. Clara didn't bother explaining to Jamie why they couldn't stay. He already understood. Something was wrong. Something far beyond their comprehension. And the only thing they could do was run. As they loaded their bags into the car, Clara glanced toward the woods. The snowman wasn't there, but the unease lingered, a weight pressing down on her chest. She started the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The engine sputtered but didn't catch. "Come on," she muttered, turning the key again. The engine sputtered once more, then died completely. "No," she whispered, her stomach sinking. She tried again, but the car refused to start. "Clara," Jamie said, his voice trembling. She looked at him and saw the fear in his eyes. "It's okay," she said, trying to sound calm. "We'll figure something out." But as she spoke, she saw it, movement at the edge of the woods. The snowman was back. It stood in the shadows, its jagged form almost indistinguishable from the surrounding trees. But it was there, watching, waiting. Clara's pulse quickened. She turned to Jamie. "Inside. Now." They ran back to the house, slamming the door behind them. Clara locked it, then grabbed a chair and wedged it under the knob. "What do we do?" Jamie asked, his voice shaking. Clara didn't have an answer. She paced the room, her mind racing. The car wouldn't start, the roads were still buried under snow, and their parents were miles away. "We wait," she said finally. "We wait for help." Jamie nodded, though he didn't look reassured. The hours dragged on, the silence in the house oppressive. Clara kept glancing out the window, expecting to see the snowman, but it was gone. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. The old house creaked and groaned, the wind rattling the windows. Jamie sat huddled under a blanket, his face pale. "I'm scared," he whispered. Clara sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "I know," she said softly, "but we'll be okay. I promise." She didn't believe her own words, but she couldn't let Jamie see her fear. It was near midnight when the knocking began, a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap at the door. Clara froze, her heart racing. Jamie clung to her, his eyes wide with terror. "Who is it?" he whispered. Clara shook her head, motioning for him to stay quiet. She crept toward the door, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. The knocking continued, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. "Clara!" a voice called from outside. Her blood ran cold. It was her mother's voice. "Clara, open the door," the voice said again, pleading. "It's freezing out here." She hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock. It sounded like her mother, but something about the tone was off. "Mom?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Yes, sweetheart," the voice replied. "It's me. Let me in." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at Jamie, who shook his head furiously, his face pale. "It's not her," he whispered. The knocking grew more insistent. "Clara, please," the voice cried. "I'm so cold." Clara backed away from the door, her hands shaking. The voice shifted, growing deeper, more distorted. "Let me in, Clara," it growled. The doorknob rattled violently, and the wood creaked as if something was trying to force its way inside. Clara grabbed Jamie and pulled him toward the stairs. "Upstairs, now." They raced up to her room, slamming the door behind them. Clara pushed her dresser in front of the door, barricading it as best she could. The knocking continued, now at the front door, then the windows, then the walls. "Clara," the voice called, echoing through the house. "You can't hide from me." Jamie clung to her, tears streaming down his face. "What is it?" he sobbed. "I don't know," Clara admitted, her own voice shaking. "But it's not going to get us. I won't let it." The hours stretched on, the knocking growing fainter until it finally stopped. Clara and Jamie sat huddled together, too afraid to move. When the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, Clara cautiously peered outside. The yard was empty, the snow undisturbed. But etched into the frost on the window pane, in jagged, uneven letters, was a new message. "Next time, I won't wait." She sat down on the floor, her back pressed against the wall, staring at the message. The eerie silence of the morning was almost worse than the knocking from the night before. The snow outside glittered under the pale sunlight, serene and unbroken, as if nothing had happened. And yet, Clara knew it wasn't over. When Jamie finally stirred, he blinked up at her groggily. "Is it morning?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah," she said, her voice tight. "It's morning." She didn't tell him about the new message, didn't point to the frost on the window. He didn't need to see it. "We need to get out of here," she said instead. Jamie nodded, his trust in her absolute. "But how? The car won't start." Clara thought for a moment. The nearest neighbor was miles away, but there was a small town further down the main road. If they could just make it there, someone could help. "We'll walk," she said finally. Jamie's eyes widened. "Through the snow?" "It's our only choice," Clara said. "We can't stay here. It's not safe." Jamie hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." They bundled up in their warmest clothes, layering coats, scarves, and gloves. Clara packed a small bag with snacks and water, then slung it over her shoulder. As they stepped outside, the cold hit them like a physical force. The snow crunched under their boots, and their breaths formed clouds in the frigid air. Clara glanced toward the woods, half expecting to see the snowman lurking there, but the trees stood still and silent, their bare branches coated in frost. "Stay close to me," she told Jamie, taking his hand. He nodded, his small fingers gripping hers tightly. The walk was slow and arduous, the snow coming up to their knees in some places. The cold seeped through their layers, chilling them to the bone. "Clara, I'm tired," Jamie said after what felt like hours. "We can't stop," Clara said, her voice firm. She glanced behind them, her stomach twisting. The house was no longer in sight, and she had the unsettling feeling that they were being watched. Jamie trudged on, his face pale and his steps faltering. Clara pulled him closer, trying to shield him from the biting wind. As they rounded a bend in the road, Clara froze. There, in the middle of the path, stood the snowman. It was different now, larger, more menacing. Its stick arms were outstretched, and its jagged grin seemed sharper. The coal eyes bore into her, filled with malice. Jamie whimpered, hiding behind her. "It's him," he whispered. Clara's heart pounded. She tightened her grip on Jamie's hand and took a step back. "We're going around," she said, her voice shaking. But as they turned to leave the road, the snowman moved. It wasn't a shuffle or a lurch. One moment it was standing still, and the next it was closer, as if the space between them had collapsed. Clara's breath hitched. "Run!" she said, pulling Jamie with her. They stumbled through the snow, their feet slipping and sliding as they tried to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the snowman. Clara didn't dare look back, but she could feel it. Feel the presence behind them, closing in. Jamie tripped, falling face first into the snow. Clara yanked him up, her hands trembling. "Come on!" she cried. But as they stood, the snowman was there, blocking their path. Clara shielded Jamie with her body, her mind racing. "What do you want?" she screamed at the figure. The snowman didn't respond. It loomed over them, its jagged grin stretching wider, impossibly wide. And then it spoke. "You can't run, Clara," it said, its voice deep and distorted. "You belong to me now." The ground beneath them began to tremble, the snow shifting and swirling as if alive. Clara clung to Jamie, her heart pounding. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "You can't have us." The snowman laughed, a sound that echoed through the frozen landscape. "We'll see about that." The ground gave way beneath them, and Clara and Jamie plunged into darkness. The cold was overwhelming, suffocating, as if the snow itself was alive, wrapping around them and pulling them down. Clara clutched Jamie tightly, her mind screaming for a way out. But there was no escape, no light, only the freezing blackness and the sound of the snowman's laughter echoing all around them. When Clara woke, she was lying in her bed, the sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. But then she saw the frost on the window, the words etched into the glass, "Welcome home." And she knew they were trapped, forever. Clara sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. Jamie was curled up beside her, sleeping soundly. The sunlight pouring through the window should have felt warm, reassuring. Instead, it felt sharp, intrusive, casting long shadows across the room. She turned her gaze to the frost-covered window. The words etched into the glass, "Welcome home," gleamed as if mocking her. The message was different this time, not a warning, not a threat, but a declaration, a statement of ownership. Clara's hands trembled as she reached out to shake Jamie awake. "Jamie," she whispered urgently, "we have to go, now." Jamie stirred, his face scrunching in confusion. "Clara? What's happening?" His voice was groggy, tinged with fear. She pulled him into a hug, her voice trembling. "I don't know, Jamie, but we can't stay here. Something is wrong with this place." Jamie nodded, his small hands clutching her tightly. "But where can we go?" Clara didn't have an answer. The car wouldn't start. The snow was too deep to trek through, and now it felt like even the house itself was conspiring against them. But she couldn't let Jamie see her fear. She had to stay strong, for both of them. The first thing Clara noticed as they stepped into the hallway was the silence. It was oppressive, like the house was holding its breath. The faint creaks and groans of the old building had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. She led Jamie toward the stairs, her hand gripping his tightly. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the air around them was thickening, weighing them down. "Do you hear that?" Jamie whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara froze, straining her ears. At first, there was nothing. Then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps crunching through snow. But it was coming from inside the house. Her grip on Jamie tightened. "Stay close to me," she whispered, her voice barely steady. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and Clara peered into the living room. It was empty, the furniture bathed in the pale morning light. The sound had stopped, but the sense of being watched hadn't. She felt it like a weight on her back, pressing her forward, urging her to move faster. "Clara!" Jamie's voice trembled, and she turned to see him staring at the front door. Her breath caught in her throat. The door was wide open. Snow had blown into the entryway, a thin layer of frost coating the floor. But that wasn't what made Clara's heart stop. Standing just outside, framed by the blinding white of the snow, was the snowman. It was taller now, its jagged grin stretching impossibly wide. The coal eyes seemed to glow, a malevolent light flickering deep within them. Its stick arms were no longer sticks. They were long, gnarled branches, twisted and sharp like claws. "Clara," Jamie whispered again, his voice barely audible. The snowman tilted its head, as if studying them. Then slowly, it raised one of its branch-like arms and pointed at them. Clara grabbed Jamie and bolted for the kitchen, her heart pounding. She slammed the door behind them, locking it with trembling hands. She didn't know if a lock would stop it, but it was all she could do. "Clara, what's happening?" Jamie asked, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know," she snapped, then immediately regretted it. She knelt down, holding his face in her hands. "I'm sorry, Jamie. I don't know what's happening, but I promise I'll keep you safe." He nodded, his lower lip quivering. "What do we do now?" Clara looked around the kitchen, her mind racing. The windows were frosted over and the back door was blocked by a mountain of snow. They were trapped. "We'll hide," she said finally. "We'll wait it out." She led Jamie to the pantry, a small, cramped space with just enough room for the two of them. They huddled together, Clara's arms wrapped tightly around Jamie as she tried to keep him warm. The house was silent again, but Clara knew better than to trust the quiet. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement. Minutes stretched into hours, and the cold seeped into her bones. Then, just as she was starting to think they might be safe, she heard it. A faint scratching sound, coming from the other side of the pantry door. Jamie whimpered, burying his face in her chest. Clara held him tighter, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the snowman could hear it. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Then came the voice. "Clara." It was deep, distorted, and somehow familiar. "You can't hide from me." Her breath caught in her throat. She clamped a hand over Jamie's mouth, willing him to stay silent. The scratching turned to pounding, the door rattling on its hinges. "Let me in, Clara," the voice growled. "I'm getting impatient." The pounding stopped, and for a moment there was silence again. Clara dared to hope that it was over. Then the door burst open, splinters flying as the snowman forced its way inside. Clara screamed. shielding Jamie with her body as the creature loomed over them. "Enough games," it said, its jagged grin widening. "You're mine now." Clara's mind raced. There had to be a way out, a way to stop it. Desperation gave her strength, and she grabbed the first thing she could reach, a jar of salt from the pantry shelf. She flung it at the snowman, the jar shattering and the salt scattering across its body. The creature let out an unearthly scream, its form convulsing as the salt began to eat away at it. Clara didn't wait to see what would happen next. She grabbed Jamie and ran, tearing through the house and out the back door, the snowman's screams echoing behind them. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the woods, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Clara turned back, half expecting to see the snowman chasing them, but it was gone. For now. "Clara." Jamie's voice was barely a whisper. "Is it over?" She pulled him into a tight hug, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we're not going back." As they stumbled through the snow, heading toward the faint outline of the town in the distance, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Somewhere behind them, in the frozen silence of the woods, the snowman was waiting, and it would return. Story 5. It began with a whisper in the cold air. The town of Black Hollow was no stranger to harsh winters. Snow blanketed the streets, trees stood as skeletal silhouettes against the pale gray sky, and the lake at the edge of the town froze solid every year. But this winter was different. The snow seemed heavier, the nights colder, and the silence unbearable. Anna Bennett had always loved winters. She found peace in the crackle of a fire and the comfort of a warm blanket. But as December dragged on, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. The days were growing shorter, and the nights felt endless. The frost on her windows seemed to crawl further in each morning, etching strange patterns that almost looked like letters. The townsfolk whispered about the cold. Some claimed it wasn't natural, that it carried something with it, a presence that moved through the snow, unseen but felt. Anna dismissed their fears as superstitions. Black Hollow was an old town with old stories, after all. But then, people started disappearing. It began with small things, missing pets, abandoned cars found on snow-covered roads. Then it escalated. A man named Mr. Carver, who owned the general store, vanished one night while closing up. His footprints were found in the snow outside the store, leading to the woods, but they stopped abruptly as though he'd been plucked from the earth. Anna heard the rumors, but she tried to stay rational. She lived alone, in a cabin at the edge of town, and had always prided herself on her independence. When the power started flickering at night and strange noises echoed from the forest, she told herself it was just the wind. But deep down, she knew better. One night, the power went out completely. Anna lit a few candles, their flickering light casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. She sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a thick quilt, trying to read to distract herself. But the silence was oppressive. Even the usual sounds of winter, the creak of the trees, the distant howl of the wind, were absent. Then she heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head toward the sound. Frost covered the glass, thick and opaque, but she could make out the faint outline of something standing just outside. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its hand, or what looked like a hand, pressed against the window, leaving a smear of frost behind. Anna's heart raced. She reached for her phone, but there was no signal. Her hands trembled as she clutched the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaky. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence again. Then, slowly, The frost on the window began to shift. It moved as though an invisible finger was dragging through it, forming letters. "Come out!" Anna's blood ran cold. She stumbled back from the window, knocking over a candle. The flames sputtered out, plunging the room into near darkness. The tapping resumed, louder this time, more insistent. She didn't dare look outside again. Instead, she grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the back of the cabin. She needed to find something, anything, to defend herself. Her father's old hunting rifle was propped against the wall in the pantry. She grabbed it, her hands trembling as she checked the chamber. It was loaded. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a new sound. A soft, crunching noise, like footsteps in the snow. It was moving around the house. Anna's breathing quickened. She pressed her back against the wall, clutching the rifle tightly. The footsteps stopped outside the back door. Knock, knock. The sound was slow and deliberate, each knock echoing through the silent cabin. "Go away!" Anna shouted, her voice cracking. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a voice, low, cold, and inhuman, spoke from the other side of the door. "You can't hide forever, Anna." Her heart nearly stopped. It knew her name. She bolted for the stairs, her only thought to get as far away from the doors and windows as possible. She locked herself in the bedroom, shoving a heavy dresser in front of the door. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to calm herself, but the voice echoed in her mind. "You can't hide forever." She sat on the floor, clutching the rifle, and tried to think. What was this thing? Why was it here? And how did it know her name? The frost on the bedroom window began to spread, creeping inward like a living thing. The glass fogged over, and for a moment, Anna thought she could see a face in the frost. Sharp features, hollow eyes, and a jagged smile. It whispered her name again, so faint she almost thought she imagined it. Anna. The next hours passed in a haze of fear. She stayed in the bedroom, too terrified to move. The footsteps outside the cabin came and went, sometimes near, sometimes distant, but the voice never returned. When dawn finally broke, Anna dared to look out the window. The frost had melted, leaving the glass clear. She could see the forest beyond, the snow glistening in the morning light. The thing was gone, or so she thought. The next day, Anna went into town, desperate for answers. The streets were eerily quiet, many of the shops boarded up. She found a few townsfolk huddled in the diner, their faces pale and drawn. "Did you see it?" she asked, her voice trembling. The others exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, an older man spoke up. "It's the Frost Keeper," he said. "An old legend. They say it comes during the harshest winters, taking those who stray too far into the snow. But now, it's coming into town." Anna's stomach turned. "Why? What does it want?" The man shook his head. "No one knows. But if it's marked you..." He trailed off, his expression grim. "Marked me?" Anna whispered. He nodded. "The frost. If it writes your name, you're its next victim." Anna's blood ran cold. The frost on her window, the letters it had written. She left the diner in a daze, her mind racing. The Frost Keeper had marked her. But why? And how could she stop it? That night she didn't go home. Instead, she drove to the church at the center of town, seeking refuge. The priest, Father Michaels, welcomed her inside, his kind eyes filled with concern. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked. Anna nodded, her voice shaking as she recounted her encounter. Father Michaels listened silently, then crossed himself. "There's a way to banish it," he said, "but it's dangerous." "I'll do whatever it takes," Anna said. Father Michaels explained the ritual. It required facing the Frostkeeper directly, luring it into a circle of blessed salt, and binding it with an incantation. Anna's fear warred with her determination. She didn't want to face the creature again, but she had no choice. The next night, armed with the salt and the priest's instructions, she returned to her cabin. She prepared the circle in the living room, her hands shaking as she worked. Then she waited. The Frostkeeper didn't make her wait long. The tapping began just after midnight, slow and deliberate. "Come in," Anna called, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her insides. The door creaked open, and the Frostkeeper stepped inside. It was even more terrifying up close, its hollow eyes glinting with malice. "You can't stop me," it hissed. Anna didn't reply. She stepped back into the circle of salt, clutching the piece of paper with the incantation written on it. The Frostkeeper lunged at her, but the moment it crossed the circle, it froze. Anna began to chant, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. The creature thrashed, its jagged grin twisting into a snarl. "You'll never be free of me," it growled. With a final shout, Anna completed the incantation. The Frostkeeper let out an unearthly scream, its form dissolving into a whirlwind of frost and snow. When it was over, Anna collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The cabin was silent again, the air warm and still. She had won. But as she looked out the window, she saw the frost creeping across the glass once more. And in the distance, the woods whispered her name. The frost on the window crept in delicate, icy tendrils, as though mocking Anna's brief victory. Exhaustion weighed her down, but the sight reignited her fear. She could still feel the chill of the Frostkeeper's presence, lingering like a shadow in her mind. She backed away from the window, her heart hammering in her chest. "No," she whispered. "I stopped you. I ended this." But deep down, Anna knew that wasn't entirely true. The ritual had worked. She had banished the creature, but something still felt incomplete. Its final words echoed in her mind. "You'll never be free of me." Was it a threat, a warning, or the truth? The next morning, Anna left the cabin and returned to town. She hoped to find Father Michaels, to tell him about the frost returning. But the church was locked, the windows dark. She knocked, calling out his name, but no one answered. At the diner, the remaining townsfolk seemed even more on edge. Whispers of more disappearances spread among them, and Anna overheard a woman sobbing about her husband, who had vanished overnight. Anna approached the counter, her voice trembling as she asked, "Have you seen Father Michaels?" The waitress, a weary-looking woman named Clara, shook her head. "He's gone," she said. "Gone?" Anna's stomach twisted. Clara leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He went out last night, said he was going to check on you. Didn't come back." Anna's blood ran cold. She returned to her cabin that afternoon, her mind racing with guilt and fear. Had the Frostkeeper taken Father Michaels? Was it her fault for involving him? The frost on her window was worse now, covering nearly the entire pane. As she watched, it began to shift again, forming new patterns. Letters, words. "You can't run." Anna stumbled back, a cry escaping her lips. The words vanished as quickly as they had appeared, but the message was clear. The Frostkeeper wasn't finished with her. She knew she couldn't stay in the cabin. She packed a bag with essentials, grabbed the rifle, and headed to her car. She didn't know where she would go, just away from Black Hollow, away from the frost. But when she turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. She tried again. Nothing. Her breath fogged in the icy air as she realized her car was encased in frost, the windows and doors frozen shut. Desperation clawed at her chest. She grabbed her bag and began walking toward town. The snow crunched beneath her boots, the cold biting at her face, but she didn't stop. The forest loomed on either side of the road, the trees dark and silent. Every shadow seemed to move, every gust of wind carrying a whisper. Anna. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. Anna. It came from the woods, low and beckoning. She tightened her grip on the rifle and quickened her pace, refusing to look. But the whispers grew louder, closer. The road felt endless, the town farther away with each step. Snow began to fall, heavy and relentless, obscuring her path. She could barely see a few feet ahead, the world around her dissolving into a swirling white void. And then she saw them. Footprints in the snow, leading off the road and into the forest. They were fresh, the edges sharp against the blanket of white. Anna hesitated. The footprints were human, and they might belong to Father Michael's, or someone else in trouble. But she knew better. Don't follow them, she whispered to herself. The whispers in the trees grew louder, almost pleading. Anna, help us. Her chest tightened. The voice sounded different now, familiar. It sounded like her mother's voice, soft and warm, the way it had been before she passed away years ago. Anna, please. Tears pricked her eyes. She shook her head, trying to block out the voice, but her feet betrayed her, moving toward the footprints. The forest was darker than she remembered. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches clawing at her jacket. The footprints led deeper and deeper, winding through the snow-covered underbrush. Anna, you're almost there, the voice said. She stopped abruptly, her breath hitching. No, she said aloud, her voice trembling. You're not real. This isn't real. The forest fell silent. Then the laughter began. It started softly, like the rustle of leaves, but grew louder, harsher, until it echoed all around her. It wasn't her mother's voice anymore. It was the Frost Keeper. You should have stayed in the circle, it hissed. Anna turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. The snow seemed to pull at her legs, slowing her down. The laughter followed her, growing louder, closer. She tripped, falling face first into the snow. Pain shot through her knee, but she scrambled to her feet, clutching the rifle. The trees ahead parted, revealing a clearing. In the center stood a massive oak, its gnarled branches twisting upward like frozen claws. And beneath the tree, a figure waited. It was Father Michael's. Father! Anna cried, relief flooding through her. She limped toward him, but stopped abruptly when she saw his face. His eyes were empty, his skin pale and frosted over. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, his body collapsed into a pile of snow, leaving behind only the Frost Keeper. It loomed over her, its jagged grin wider than before. You can't escape me, Anna, it said. You're mine. Anna raised the rifle, her hand shaking. Stay back, she warned. The creature laughed. Do you really think that will stop me? She fired. The shot echoed through the forest, and the Frost Keeper staggered back, a hole in its chest. But instead of blood, frost and snow poured from the wound, swirling around it like a storm. It straightened, the hole already sealing itself. You can't kill the cold, it said. Anna realized she couldn't fight it. Not like this. She turned and ran again, ignoring the pain in her knee. The Frostkeeper's laughter followed her, but she didn't look back. She stumbled back onto the road, the snowstorm blinding her. In the distance, she saw headlights cutting through the white haze. A truck. She waved her arms, shouting for help. The truck slowed, its tires crunching on the icy road. A man rolled down the window, his face weathered and concerned. "Need a ride?" "Yes," Anna gasped. "Please, I need to get out of here." She climbed into the truck, slamming the door behind her. The warmth of the heater was a stark contrast to the icy grip of the Frostkeeper. As the truck drove away, Anna glanced out the window. In the distance, at the edge of the forest, she saw the Frostkeeper watching her, its grin wider than ever. "You can't run forever," it whispered, its voice carried on the wind. The road stretched on, but Anna knew the truth. The cold wasn't just outside. It was inside her now, a part of her. And no matter how far she went, it would follow. The Frostkeeper never truly let go.